You experience time every second, but you've never really understood it. In the next few minutes, 13 facts will rewire how you see the clock, including one about a place on Earth where a day only lasts a few hours. Let's begin. Here's a fact that will break your brain. Sharks are older than trees. Yes, the same sharks swimming in our oceans today existed before a single tree stood on Earth. Sharks first appeared around 450 million years ago, patrolling ancient seas long before forests. Trees? They didn't show up until roughly 385 million years ago. That's a 65 million year head start. To put that in perspective, when the first sharks were born, the land was barren rock and moss, not a leaf in sight. Sharks have survived 5 mass extinctions, outliving the dinosaurs, which arrived a mere 230 million years ago. So the next time you see a shark, remember, you're looking at a creature so ancient, it watched the very first tree grow from nothing. Sharks are living fossils older than the forests themselves. Picture opening a can of food with a hammer and chisel. For nearly 50 years, that was the only way. Canned food was invented in 1810, when Englishman Peter Durand patented sealing food in tin. Napoleon's armies and explorers carried these cans across the world, but nobody thought to invent the tool that opens them. Early cans were thick iron, and the labels literally instructed people to use a chisel and hammer. Soldiers stabbed them with bayonets. It wasn't until 1858 that Ezra Warner patented the first can opener in America. That's 48 years of eating from cans people could barely open. We sent food into the future, then forgot to bring the key. Sometimes the invention arrives long before the simple idea that finally makes it useful. Quick question, which came first, the telephone or the fax machine? You'd bet the telephone, right? Wrong. In 1843, decades before anyone dreamed of calling their neighbor, a Scottish inventor named Alexander Bain patented a machine that could transmit images over wires. He used a swinging pendulum and electric pulses to scan a message and recreate it far away. That's a fax machine. Now here's the timeline. Bain's patent landed in 1843. Alexander Graham Bell didn't patent the telephone until 1876. That's a full 33 years earlier. So while people were still writing letters and waiting weeks for replies, the technology to fax a document already existed. The device you thought was born in the 1980s office is actually older than the telephone, the light bulb, and the automobile. History's been faxing us the truth all along. You think video calls are a smartphone thing? Think again. Long before FaceTime, before Zoom, people were staring at live moving faces through a screen, and it happened almost 90 years ago. In 1936, Germany's postal service launched the world's first public video phone network. You'd walk into a special booth, sit before a camera and a screen, and see the person on the other end in real time. The line connected Berlin and Leipzig, about 160 kilometers apart. Each call cost roughly 3 Reichsmarks for 3 minutes, and the screen showed an 8-inch black and white image at 18 frames per second. So while your grandparents were kids, strangers in pre-war Germany were already video calling across cities. No internet, no satellites, just cables and tubes. The future arrived, then quietly vanished for 50 years. Here's a fact that breaks your brain. Harvard University is older than calculus. Yes, the math. In 1636, colonists in Massachusetts founded Harvard, America's first college. Students there studied Latin, theology, and Greek. But there was no calculus, because it didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be invented for another 30 years. Isaac Newton wasn't even born until 1642, 6 years after Harvard opened its doors. He and Gottfried Leibniz wouldn't develop calculus until the 1660s and 1680s. So for decades, Harvard graduated class after class of educated men who had never seen a derivative or an integral. Think about that. An entire university, lecture halls, degrees, a library, existed before humanity discovered how to calculate the area under a curve. Harvard didn't just witness the birth of calculus. It was already middle-aged when it happened. Picture a classroom. Students hunched over parchment, candles flickering, professors lecturing in Latin. Now picture the mighty Aztec Empire, vast pyramids, bustling markets, an emperor ruling millions. Which came first? You'd guess the ancient Aztecs, right? Wrong. Teaching began at Oxford University way back in 1096. By 1167, it was a thriving school. Now here's the twist. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, wasn't even founded until 1325, over 200 years later. When Aztec priests laid the first stones of their island city, Oxford had already been graduating scholars for centuries. And when Spanish conquistadors toppled the Aztec Empire in 1521, Oxford was still going strong. So the next time someone calls the Aztecs ancient, remember, an English university was already old when their empire was brand new. Picture this. While the pharaohs were building the Great Pyramid of Giza around 2560 BC, woolly mammoths were still walking the earth. We think of mammoths as ancient, buried deep in the Ice Age alongside cavemen and saber-toothed cats. But a small group survived, stranded on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean off Siberia. That population hung on, grazing and breeding, long after the mainland herds vanished. The pyramids were finished. Egypt built temples, crowned kings, and buried Tutankhamun. And through all of it, mammoths were still alive. The last ones finally died out around 1650 BC. That means when the youngest pyramid-era pharaohs ruled, mammoths were still breathing. So the next time you call something old as the pyramids, remember, somewhere in the frozen north, a mammoth was already outliving them. Picture 1996. Electric cars feel brand new, right? Wrong. The electric car actually beat gasoline by decades. Back in 1832, Scottish inventor Robert Anderson built a crude electric carriage. That's before Queen Victoria even took the throne. By 1890, William Morrison rolled out a working electric wagon in Iowa carrying 6 passengers. Meanwhile, Carl Benz didn't patent the first gasoline automobile until 1886. And here's the kicker. By 1900, a full third of all cars on American roads ran on electricity, silent and clean. Then cheap oil and Henry Ford's assembly line buried them for a century. So the next time someone calls electric cars a modern invention, remember, they were quietly humming down streets before your great-great-grandparents were born. The future is actually older than the past we imagined. Picture the Eiffel Tower rising over Paris, brand new, gleaming iron, the marvel of 1889. Now picture Mario. These two feel like different centuries, right? Here's the twist. They're from the exact same year. The Eiffel Tower opened its doors on March 31st, 1889. And just 6 months later, on September 23rd, 1889, a man named Fusajiro Yamauchi founded a little shop in Kyoto, Japan. It didn't make video games. It made hand-painted playing cards. That shop was Nintendo. So the company behind Zelda, Pokemon, and the Switch is older than most of your great-great-grandparents. It survived 2 world wars, the invention of the airplane, and the birth of the internet, all before it ever printed a single pixel. Nintendo isn't just old. It's basically a 19th century antique that learned to make Mario. Picture a T-Rex looking up at a Stegosaurus, like an old cousin. Except they never met. Not even close. The Stegosaurus went extinct around 150 million years ago. But the Tyrannosaurus Rex didn't stomp onto the scene until roughly 66 million years ago. That's a gap of about 84 million years separating these two icons. Now here's where your brain melts. You, sitting there right now, are only 66 million years removed from the T-Rex. Do the math. You are closer in time to a living, breathing Tyrannosaurus Rex than that T-Rex ever was to a Stegosaurus. The dinosaurs we cram onto. The same poster were separated by more time than separates us from them. Deep time isn't just big. It's unimaginably, dizzyingly enormous. And we're barely a footnote at the very end. Here's a fact that breaks your brain. Cleopatra feels ancient, right? Egyptian queen, pyramids, sand. But she lived closer to us than to the people who built those pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza was finished around 2560 BC. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC. That's roughly 2,500 years between them. Now count forward from Cleopatra's death in 30 BC to the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. That's only about 2,000 years. So when Cleopatra looked up at the pyramids, they were already older to her than she is to us. She was closer in time to astronauts walking on the moon than to the pharaohs who stacked those ancient stones. The pyramids weren't her history. They were her ancient history. Let that rewire your sense of time completely. Picture the guillotine. You imagine powdered wigs, the French Revolution, 1793. But here's the twist. France was still chopping off heads long after Elvis, long after color TV, long after the first man walked on the moon. The last public execution by guillotine happened in 1939. But behind prison walls, the blade kept falling. On September 10, 1977, a man named Hamida Jandoubi became the final person executed this way. That's the same year Star Wars premiered in theaters. The same year Apple was founded. While people lined up for the very first personal computers, France was still using a medieval-looking beheading machine. It wasn't abolished until 1981. So the guillotine and the VHS tape existed at the exact same time. Wait, what? Picture 1903. Two bicycle mechanics from Ohio drag a flimsy wooden contraption onto a windy North Carolina beach. December 17th, Orville Wright lifts off for 12 seconds and flies 120 feet. Humanity has finally left the ground. Now guess how long until someone completely rewrites the universe? A whole century? 50 years? Try two. In 1905, a 26-year-old patent clerk named Albert Einstein publishes Special Relativity, bending time and space themselves. So while the world was still gasping at the idea that men could fly a few feet above the sand, Einstein was already proving that clocks tick slower when you move, and that light sets the speed limit of reality. Powered flight and the fabric of space-time cracked open just 24 months apart. The same brief window humanity learned to hop off the ground. It also learned time isn't fixed. Picture this. The last woolly mammoths were still breathing when Egyptian workers stacked the final stone on the Great Pyramid. Sounds impossible, right? We think of mammoths as ancient, cavemen, ice ages, tar pits. But here's the twist. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BC. Meanwhile, on a frozen speck called Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, a tiny herd of woolly mammoths clung to life until roughly 1650 BC. That's nearly 1,000 years after the pyramid was finished. So while pharaohs ruled Egypt and hieroglyphs were being carved, real living mammoths were still wandering the tundra, munching grass. The last of them died out more recently than the pyramid was born. The Ice Age beast and the ancient wonder, alive at the same time. History is stranger than you think. You know the phrase, the greatest thing since sliced bread? Well, Betty White literally predates it. The beloved comedian was born on January 17, 1922, in Oak Park, Illinois. Back then, bread came in whole loaves, and you sliced every piece by hand. It wasn't until July 7, 1928, that a machine in Chillicothe, Missouri, sold the very first loaf of pre-sliced bread to the public. Do the math. By the time bread showed up neatly sliced in stores, Betty White was already 6 years old, walking, talking, and probably eating toast her family cut themselves. So the next time someone calls a new gadget the best thing since sliced bread, remember, Betty White beat that invention to the shelf. She was a living legend before convenience bread even existed. Time bends, stretches, and lies to you constantly, and now you'll notice it everywhere. If just one of these facts surprised you, hit subscribe so the next mind-bending list finds you first.